You're listening to TIP.
Welcome to the video version of the Real Estate 101 podcast, where we tackle everything about real estate investing. On today's show, I bring back Chad Carson to talk about how his real estate strategies have been doing during the pandemic, as well as opportunities that he sees moving forward. Chad was our first ever guest on this real estate podcast and has several other titles under his belt: entrepreneur, real estate investor, author, and teacher. Chad also hosts the Real Estate and Financial Independence podcast. I'm excited to bring back Chad, or Coach, as a lot of people call him. Not only was he our first ever guest on this podcast, but he has also been the most downloaded episode on the show. And it's for good reason. He is able to explain real estate concepts with clarity and in an easy to understand way. And he also approaches real estate with a very level head and takes a logical approach, which I think is super helpful for beginners in a world where a lot of people are trying to get rich quick. Now, without further delay, let's get into this week's episode with Chad Carson.
You're listening to Real Estate Investing by the Investors Podcast Network, where your host, Robert Leonard, interviews successful investors from various real estate investing niches to help educate you on your real estate investing journey.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Real Estate 101 podcast. As always, I'm your host, Robert Leonard, and with me today I bring back Chad Carson. Welcome to the show, Chad.
Good to be here, Robert. Thanks for having me back.
You were the very first ever guest on this real estate podcast, all the way back on episode 1. It's almost hard to believe because we're on episode 56 already, and a lot has certainly changed in the world since then. For those who don't remember your story or didn't hear that episode, tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah, it does seem like a long time ago, but congrats on the 56 episodes. And for those who didn't listen to that one or don't know me, I live in Clemson, South Carolina, and I've been investing in real estate for 18 years now, which is kind of hard for me to believe as well. Right when I got out of college at Clemson University, I started investing. I thought it was a temporary thing. I thought I would do it for a couple of years, learn a few financial tricks, and hey, I'll use this the rest of my life and I'll get a real job. Well, it turns out I like being, what do they call this? Like voluntarily unemployed, being an entrepreneur. Like banks consider me unemployed because I didn't, as a young 23-year-old, here I am trying to flip houses and wholesale properties and eventually start buying some rental properties. But I really love the excitement of that and the challenge of being an entrepreneur full time. And I was fortunately in the place in my life where I didn't have any college debt because I had got a scholarship to play football in college. So that was helpful. Also had support from family, and people kind of knew that other resources and people who were in the business. And so I just decided to take off while I was still single and could live out of my car if I needed to, if things didn't work out. And the rest is history. I've done a lot of different things in real estate, but primarily single family houses, small multi-unit properties in and around my area of Clemson, South Carolina.
How'd you get started? When you just came out of college, what was the first things you got into? Did you become an agent? Did you get into rentals, flipping? Where'd you start?
Not get my license right off the bat, although I think I would if I had to do it over again. I just think that's a good route to get started. When you need to make money, having your license is one way to get paid. So why wouldn't you do that? That's my opinion. But the way I approached it was more about just being a wholesaler. So I was finding deals for other people. I would get them under contract, and I didn't have a lot of money, really any money. And so I had to go to other people who could buy the property and either partner with me on the deal, or more commonly, they would buy the deal, they would keep it as a rental, but then I would flip the deal to them basically. So I might make $2,000, I might make $5,000 in a really good scenario, 15 or 20 grand. And that was my kind of first year and a half or so. But then so I put food on the table. It allowed me to learn the business. I was really good at finding deals. I kind of picked one little slice of the business and got good at that. And fortunately, that was it's one of the more difficult parts of the business, as you know. And so by doing that, I could then expand from there. And I have a business partner who's been my business partner now for about 18 years. And we started kind of partnering together. Neither one of us had a lot of money at the time, but we figured out ways that we would split up the task, and we would start flipping houses where we would go out and find a private lender, somebody to loan us money on the property. And then we would buy it. Instead of assigning it to somebody else, we would buy the property, manage the remodel project. And so that was kind of the evolution. We were always flipping houses for the first 3 or 4 years just to make money because we didn't have any reserves, we really couldn't keep properties and have enough down payment money for rentals yet. But that was our way of getting started.
You mentioned that you're mostly focused on single families and small multifamily, but you've been in the business 18 years. From who I've talked to, that's typically pretty unusual. I think a lot of people, as they've been in real estate for so long, they tend to get into much larger deals, syndications, 100-unit apartment complexes. Why have you chosen not to go that route?
I think it fit more of my goal, my lifestyle. And I did try to go that route a little bit. My business partner and I in 2007, we went to seminars. It was equivalent of reading Bigger Pockets and listening to podcasts back in the day, where we would find other people who were really impressive. We're like, wow, they're doing hundreds of deals a year and they're flipping houses and syndicating and doing all that. For a year there, we tried to ramp up what we were doing as well. And we invested a lot of money in marketing. And we were pretty successful on the whole. Like we had some people working with us and had a little team, and we had people buying properties for us. And we had, I think, 39 closings in 2007. And some of those were multiple properties. So we bought some multi-unit properties to keep. We flipped a lot of properties. So we made some cash flow. We made some good rental buys. The problem was at the end of the year, we kind of stepped back, and I credit my business partner with this more than me. We both sort of reflected on what we were doing, and we were busy, and we were making all this progress and money, but we asked ourselves, like, why are we doing this business in the first place? Like, we kind of lost sight of what we were trying to accomplish and whether this mechanism of going big really helped us accomplish what we wanted. And we actually did an exercise where we wrote down on a piece of paper, each of us, what are the things that matter to us? Like, what would we do if money was not an issue? And I wrote things down like, I would like to play pickup basketball in the middle of the day for 2 hours. And I would like to go out in the woods and hike and walk around. And once I met my wife, we got married that year. In fact, when I had discussions with her about it, we wanted to travel abroad. We wanted to kind of take long, slow trips to Latin America and to Spain and take siestas and enjoy life a little bit. And I'm still kind of go-getter, A mentality type person, but there was the balance of that. And what I found when I wrote that list, some of those involved money. I did need money, but much more of a restriction was how much free time and flexibility did I have. And so for me, dialing back the business and making sure the business is kind of the servant to your lifestyle and what your goals are and not the other way around became the priority for us. And so I'm not saying you can't syndicate and have 10,000 units and have lifestyle as well. But what my experience has been is in that pursuit of grow, bigger, you lose a lot along the way. And if you're really ambitious and you do really well, and in 5 or 7 years, you sell out and you make about your millions of bucks, then you can enjoy the rest of your life, right? Well, that rarely happens exactly like that. And a lot of people who do that end up saying, I would rather go start another business than just sit here and do nothing. And so I think going back to like the main point of this was having fewer properties, smaller properties that are more flexible, that are a little bit more consistent, and not having to get big and have different structures and raise money from lots and lots and lots of other people. Keeping it simple and just doing that repeatedly kind of fit our lifestyle when we reverse engineered it.
I think that's one of the reasons why you and I have such a great relationship and why we have such great conversations, because we both think that way. And for me, that's been a big shift, because when I first was graduating college, all the way growing up through high school and even in college, I just wanted to be a billionaire. That's all I wanted. I think we've talked about this. I just wanted to make billions and billions of dollars. I wanted private jets. I wanted all of that. And then I stumbled onto you and we started talking, and even just life in general for me has evolved. And I just realized that that's not necessarily what's important to me. And there's a lot more to being able to do what I want with my time than there is just having all the money in the world. We talked about it before we started recording today. I'm going back to racing motocross. It's one of the things that matters to me. And if I have $1 billion business that I'm running, I'm not going to be able to go ride dirt bikes every day like I want to.
And there's a fine line. I mean, it's not like we all have a recipe that works for every person. Like the recipe for Robert Leonard is a little bit different for Chad Carson, and every listener on this call is going to have a little bit different recipe for what that investing business looks like. And there's some people who are going to be able to manage the grow big and have 10,000 units kind of stuff and still do all that. And that's great. But I guess my message that really resonated with me, and I think a lot of other people think the same way, is that try to have the smallest business necessary and the simplest business necessary that accomplishes your life goals. And whatever that is, build it. If you get bigger than that, just at least acknowledge to yourself that this is just an ego thing, or this is just me wanting to compete with all these other people and I just want to win. That's cool too. If you just want to win and be the best and be the biggest, fine. But just don't frame it as that's what you need to do to have this lifestyle, to live this amazing life. Like, you do not need all that. You can have 8 properties or 3 properties and live an amazing lifestyle, make a big impact on your family and your community. And that kind of go small or go home message is what I think more people need to hear instead of the other way around.
If you decide you want to win and compete and be the biggest, that's what you're deciding what matters. So you're making a conscious decision to decide what matters to you and what do you want to spend your time doing. And in that case, that's what you chose.
Exactly.
And the same thing for me is like simplicity. That's so important. It's doing what matters, but also just simple is so much less stressful. And for me, like, I was the type of guy that would, if I could earn $50 by opening a savings account and depositing $1,000, I would go do it. And for me, it's just like, that's not worth it to me anymore. That simplicity is just, or the complexity there is not worth it. I like simplicity. And it's the same thing with, building a business.
Yeah, behind the scenes of businesses and of real estate, I think is not talked about enough. It's not as exciting to talk about the bookkeeping systems and the administrative stuff and the people you need to hire and the issues you're going to have with human resources behind the scenes of a big business. That's not as exciting as, hey, I built this, big multi-million-dollar business and I'm making all this revenue. But, there's always fires and there's always complication behind the scene. And if the business matters to you, and this goes back to why you're doing it in the first place, if it's accomplishing your goals and it's fun, like you'll deal with all those little things behind the scenes. But to your point, like that complexity and those aggravations behind the scenes, if you're doing it just for a temporary high, like it's just like you get your little dopamine fix by going a little bit bigger, yeah, that's not going to last. Like you gotta build something that, because it's not as easy to get out of a business or get out of a real estate property as it is to get into it. And so you got to be real thoughtful about that and not outrun your motivation, because then you get stuck with something that is like an albatross around your neck, and it's weighing you down, and it's keeping you for decades maybe from doing things that you thought were important when you were younger, and now you're not doing them.
You are one of the few people in the real estate space that I've talked to that actually also believes in stock investing. Typically, everybody in the real estate space is, tisk to stock investing, but you're one of the people that aligns with me and that you should have exposure to both. So you'll understand my next analogy, but it's the same thing for stock investing. I used to love picking every single individual stock, and I still do that, but I've done it a lot more simple. I do a lot of index funds now, and I just pick companies that is a more simple process for me. Like, I'm not chasing Tesla. I'm not chasing GameStop, which is going crazy right now. Like, I'm not going out after all these super complex option strategies that a lot of millennials are after. I'm like really focused on simplicity, what's really going to align with my core values and doing what matters for me.
Yeah, I'm certainly in the same philosophy. I've learned a lot from your philosophy and what you teach about balance and different types of investing. And my own stock investing strategy is primarily in my retirement accounts. That's and for me, like, I just want to kind of set it and forget it. And so I would love to own one index fund, and that's it. Stock investing for me, just in my order of priority, is like the next level, kind of the backup to the backup. Like, my real estate's first, or maybe my kind of entrepreneurial ventures when I'm doing them. That's kind of the first level of income, and then real estate income, and then the wealth that the real estate's growing. And then for me, stock investing and maybe some other type assets eventually are a diversification. And so if that's the priority of those, then I really don't want to spend all my time messing with them and balancing them. And the simpler that can be, the better. And it actually turns out, I mean, you'll probably can speak to this better than I can, but most of the statistics I've read that actually is probably going to be better in the long run anyway. The performance of your basic little index fund without you messing with it is going to do just as well, and you're going to have lower fees than any other strategy. And I kind of take good consolation in that the simplest is also pretty effective.
From conversations we've had both on the podcast and offline, I know that your portfolio has a bit of exposure to student rentals and just a little piece of Airbnbs. Those are two parts of the real estate market that have probably been hit the hardest from COVID. How are you managing students not being at school? Did you have a lot of students breaking their leases or just not renewing them?
Well, we do have a lot of exposure to student rentals. That's a big chunk of what we do. It's not 100%, but it's over 50% of our real estate investing rentals. I'll tell you, back in March of 2020, I was a little anxious. I was, you could ask my wife, she would say, she went to the store, and we're good. Like, our income's fine, but I think my reflex is that when things go bad, I'm like, button down the hatches, bring in the, save every bit of cash you can. Like, I was kind got a little irrational at that moment. And I was just telling my wife, don't buy that $100 thing at the store or whatever. And I was just take it easy. And it was because I was a little worried that what I had is something we hadn't seen before all over the economy, but just particularly with student rentals and college rentals. Are they going to come back to school? Like, if people are 100% online or 99% online, will they come and rent an apartment? Which is what we do. We rent apartments to students. That was an open question. And my business partner and I, we're kind of worst case thinkers when it comes to investing. All right, how much cash are we going to have to save if nobody comes back to school for the next 12 months, starting in August? That's what we started thinking about. And we actually went through the exercises of, okay, all right, maybe we can rent 25% of our units just to some people who are local investors, but we're going to be competing with everybody else who's also doing that. And so we were just doing some really like negative cash flow scenarios, thinking about how much cash we need to set aside. And that was a pretty harrowing kind of future exercise to think about. At the same time, none of that turned out to be the case. The way it actually happened was Clemson University, where I am, was sort of a hybrid example where they asked students to come back. They had some labs that they could do safely. They did in person, but from talking to a lot of our tenants and professors here in town, almost everything's been online. And yet most of the students still came back. And I don't know, my hypothesis is that a lot of them came back because they just wanted to get out of their house from their parents, and maybe their parents could afford to let them do that. They still had enough money to pay for bills, or they had some reserves, or they had a job that they still were working. But we really didn't have the impact. We had some vacancy, we lost some rent. So it wasn't like 100% as good as it could have been. But I mean, in the big picture, it was nothing close to what we thought it would be with student rentals. But it was a harrowing kind of experience in that it makes you realize how much exposure you have. When you have a negative situation like that, you realize where your vulnerabilities are. And that was one of ours.
When March hit, thankfully, my portfolio is not really exposed to student rentals or Airbnbs. It's pretty stable for the most part. So when March hit, I personally wasn't too concerned, but there was a few people that popped right in my mind. And you were one of them because of your exposure to student rentals. Kirk Duplessis was another one. I know he has some exposure to Airbnbs and just a couple other investors that I know personally that have some exposure to Airbnbs. So you guys were definitely, I was thinking about you guys as that all was happening. I was curious. I couldn't wait to catch up with everyone to learn about, how things were going. So it's really interesting to hear how it's all played out.
The important thing for me now is that, all right, we've gotten through this. Don't let that kind of experience go to waste. And so it's sort of accelerated some of my thoughts about diversification, which has always been a philosophy of mine. But, real estate's a big, slow-moving ship. For better or worse, you don't just press a button and tomorrow you can diversify between 75% US stock and 25% international. Like, it's pretty easy to do that with liquid assets. Real estate takes a little bit more thought and thoughtfulness. And it's always been in the back of my mind and my business partner's mind that we want to spread out a little bit. And also just not have all of our, even within our own market, our non-student stuff did great. Like, and especially, which is really interesting, a lot of our lower income non-student stuff did really, really well too. So it just shows you like there's different times, different situations that are unpredictable, and different parts of your portfolio are going to do better than others. And you want to diversify in as many different ways as you can. Location, economic level, source of income. Like, don't get everybody who works in the same factory or everybody who goes to the same school. And then, but for us also, just asset classes. Let's get a little bit more exposure to different types of assets, including equities, as we just talked about. Listening to the investor podcasts, they've gotten me a little bit on the Bitcoin train. So I'm not going to go all in on that, but I'm getting a little bit. So I think it's smart to have exposure. The larger your net worth is, especially to try to diversify some and not have one thing can take your ship.
Yeah, I have to say, I got a little bit lucky. I had Preston Pish and Pomp, two powerhouses in the Bitcoin space, on the show, on my other show, Millennial Investing, in March. It was convincing enough, both the conversations. Those two guys are so brilliant that I decided to allocate about 1% of my portfolio to it. Super small. Again, going back to simplicity. I didn't want to worry about it. I didn't want to lose sleep at night. I believed in it because of what they told me, but I didn't know enough to really go all in. So I put 1% of my portfolio, but I got it at like 4,500 or so. So today it's done great, but again, small piece of my portfolio.
You can sell it to people like me who bought it at 34,000. So there you go.
There was already a trend to online learning for colleges, and now COVID has accelerated that. And I think the future of online learning, or just on campus learning, was just a little bit unclear. There's so many other avenues that people can use to learn. People might not be going to college as much. How are you viewing student rentals long term? And you just mentioned diversification. So are you looking to sell some of your student rentals and get into different types of assets?
So I'm still long on my college student rentals, in particular the college that I'm at, Clemson University. I think colleges are going to be pressured. In-person learning is going to be pressured. It's just like everything that technology is affecting. Like, I don't think anything is immune from the way technology is affecting things. And online learning and technology, the fact that information is free is definitely going to impact it. But I think there's still value in relationships. There's value in learning face-to-face. I think there's value in kind of coming of age experiences. There's even, and I think the network effect of just relationships and people is really hard to underestimate. Like, I'm in the state of South Carolina, for example. Clemson is a really good school. Some of the top academic performers in high school try to go there. It also kind of nationally has become more like that. And so if you graduate from Clemson and you get into whatever profession you are in South Carolina and more around the country, you have connections with these people that mean more sometimes than the actual stuff you learned in school. And so I don't know what the value of that is, but it's made me think about like why university is valuable. Is it worth the prices that it's pointing to? Like, I don't think so. Like, I think universities are going to have to innovate, and that's a good thing. They're being challenged. But I think so. I am selling some properties in a small way, but it's not because of I'm not excited about colleges anymore, or my college in particular. It's more what we could talk about earlier. I just think we all need to have some diversification, and we need a little bit more of that. And it's also just we've done a constant process of pruning our portfolio. Every year, I got this from John Schaub, who wrote the book Building Wealth One House at a Time, where he would look at his portfolio every year and rank them based on several criteria that are important to him. But some of those cash flow, wealth building, but also just hassle, and are there big maintenance issues and things that are recurring on this property? And so you call your herd a little bit by selling off some of the ones that are the bad performers, or maybe we don't have a lot of bad performers now, but just not your best. And so selling that and maybe doing a 1031 exchange into a new construction property or something different, that's kind of what we're playing around with. So we're dabbling in a little bit of new construction rental. We're doing some lending to other investors who are in kind of a little different niches than we are. So I think all of that's part of our plan for the reason we're distributing some of our capital to different places.
One of the other interesting dynamics with your student rentals in particular, I think with Clemson, is the athletic program that's there, both mostly football, but others as well. I think if you have colleges that have no athletics or not superior athletics, I think those colleges are going to perform differently into the future than a program like Clemson, who has a top tier football program. I think people are going to be drawn to Clemson for athletics and for various other things that you mentioned. Whereas with schools that can't offer those and are strictly just going for education, I think those two types of colleges are going to fare different. And I think you're going to be on the better of the two sides with a school that has great athletics.
Yeah, there's no doubt. Clemson's been positively affected academically because of basically the marketing of the football program. And that helps a lot. It is, if you think about it, they get paid to promote their school. It's a pretty ingenious way of, of bringing in your top academic people as well. And it's something that's not intuitive all the time. Like, why would football help the chemistry department? Well, actually, at least in Clemson's case, it has helped if you market it well. I mean, Dabo Swinney, I'm a fan. I played football at Clemson, and I think they run their program in the right way. Like, if you make sure your players graduate, you make sure they try to set good examples in the community. You can use football as like one thing, but life and these life lessons that these players are getting can be a model and kind of a part of what Clemson tries to market itself as. So I think universities are turning it more into businesses. They have to do that. They have to raise money. They have to promote themselves. And so football and athletics are one way to promote.
I mentioned before, you also had a small exposure to Airbnbs in your portfolio. I've heard from some investors that their Airbnb properties have done great. And from some articles I've read online, other investors aren't doing so great and they're getting pretty crushed. How have your Airbnb properties held up during the pandemic?
Yeah, so last time you and I talked, we had two Airbnbs. One is actually just my basement apartment. So we have a apartment that I felt like, going back to simplicity, was just extra space. My wife and I talked about it, and I used to have my office down there. We lived to an 1,100 square foot apartment in Ecuador for a year and a half. We came back to this place that was 1,900 square feet upstairs and had the 700 square foot basement apartment. And just felt like, why don't we just do something with this? And we remodeled it and rented it out. And it was just happened at Clemson, because of the football games, you could do an Airbnb rental where 80 or 90,000 people come into town, and they swap all the hotels basically. And so people want to stay in Airbnbs, and we rented it like that for a year. Well, it just so happens that there were football games this year, but they limited the attendance and there was not the same excitement. So our Airbnb in our basement sat vacant the entire year. We didn't get any rentals. It's our house, so it's not that big a deal. It's kind of supplemental income. But in other cases, actually, we have a manager who manages our Airbnb rental for us. He has other properties on the lake and out kind of in the woods. Those have done better than they've ever done. So I think it's been the local retreat type thing where people can't fly somewhere else. They can't go across the country. So they're looking for novel vacation experiences where you can be sheltered in place. And my friends who have had those type of Airbnb or vacation rental by owner type things have done better than they've ever done, keeping things full all the time. And so that's another interesting thing. Who would have thought? Like, who would have known the impacts of a pandemic on vacation rentals? And mine is done horribly because it's a game day entertainment based rental. The vacation go off on your own in the woods kind of things have done amazing. And so I don't think you'd want to have all one or the other. You'd want to have a little bit more exposure to both.
I think a lot of people think of Airbnbs and they just instantly think of downtown New York City Airbnb or Chicago or Denver or whatever it might be. And those Airbnbs are probably struggling a little bit, if I had to guess, just because of the location. But if you get to the types of Airbnbs that are less susceptible, I guess you could say, to COVID, out in the woods, those types of things like you mentioned, I would gather that those will probably continue to do well.
Yeah, but it's interesting, like the beachfront properties. So they're doing well right now because people can go to the beach and hang out and walk on the beach by themselves. But then you have a hurricane, and what happens to those? It's such a lesson. Like as this whole experience to me has been sort of like a real life wake up to like a Nassim Taleb type lesson, just of the black swans, but also unpredictability, and just you cannot predict this game. This thing it's too complex of an equation. So the only logical approach is to be anti-fragile, is to not build your finances, build your business such that you can respond to all sorts of different things. You can have a low center of gravity and move different directions. And I think that's another reason for being small, like our conversation earlier. If you get so big and grow so fast, you are actually very fragile because your cash flow is being reinvested in things. You're probably not as well capitalized, or sometimes that's the case. But you're also focused on one destination. If you can't be nimble and move around like a lot of small investors can, this type of thing can wipe you out if you happen to be in the wrong part of the economy or the wrong thing that happens.
How are you approaching Airbnbs going forward? As you diversify your portfolio, are you considering adding some more of them?
Maybe, yeah. This kind of fits in with my overall strategy that my business partner and I are trying to do. Like, our personal time is maxed out. Like, I do my own podcast, I make YouTube videos, I teach classes. I love doing that. I have a local nonprofit. I'm kind of getting interested in doing some more like social businesses locally to see how I can help there with my own community. And then you add that to my family and kind of normal stuff. Like, I'm maxed out. Like, I really don't want to go do a lot of my own time in real estate investing businesses. So I would be open to doing Airbnb and other things if there's a partner on the ground. Like, I want somebody who owns that deal, and then we'll be the lender or we'll be the limited partner with that person. And the same with flips, the same with even student rentals these days. We're kind of shifting our mentality a little bit to be the venture capitalist of the real estate, our little real estate world, instead of being the person receiving the venture capital, which we were for the entire time of our business before. And it's to be honest, it's a new skill set. I'm having to learn a lot. I'm having to take courses on that, on being an asset manager, on thinking, how do you evaluate people and how do you evaluate the deal from that perspective, and how do you manage your portfolio from that perspective? And so that's been kind of fun, just to think about it, to think about the different types of investments like Airbnb, but more that's important. But I think the person themselves is like, that's my first. I'm a relationship business driven person. So I want to know, I'm going to invest in that person. Are they going to be trustworthy? Are they going to do what they said they're going to do? Because really, if we hit one of these weird things where, their Airbnb gets wiped out for 6 months, like, I want to see how they're going to respond when that happens. Are they going to quit and just leave me with a bag, or are they going to actually like follow through and be flexible and we have to shift their payments? And that's the kind of person I'm looking for, because that's what my business partner and I were for our investors back in 2008 and 9. Like, we didn't panic. We're nervous that the economy was changing, but we communicated with our investors. We stuck with it. We shifted our strategies. And so for those of you out there who are borrowing, looking for money, you've got to demonstrate that you're that type of person to an investor. And if you do, you'll get as much money as you need, really.
That's all actually really valuable for me to hear right now. I haven't raised any money yet, but I think I might start to in the next year or two for some of the deals that I want to do. Again, I'm going to keep it simple. So I'm not going to make it super complex. I'm not going to get into massive syndications, but I think I'm going to start doing some more JVs and joint ventures for those who don't know what a JV is, but on a smaller scale with outside money. So those are really important and valuable pieces of advice for even me personally, and for anybody listening that is going to go down that same route. We've talked in the past about how, and we mentioned it a little bit earlier, about how we both tend to try and look at real estate investing similar to how Warren Buffett approaches stock investing. Typically, it's a little bit more conservative and always with a margin of safety. I know you also tend to not have a ton of debt on your portfolio. You mentioned that to me, I think, in our last episode, and that was even before the pandemic. How do you think these types of principles and strategies have helped you weather the storm that we've experienced from the pandemic? How do you think they'll help you as the real estate market evolves after COVID?
I think just that mindset of value investing has been one of the most helpful frame of minds that I've had. I mean, I've studied all sorts of different investing practitioners and teachers. I often come back to Warren Buffett. It's not that he has direct lessons on how to buy a property in a duplex and house hack something. Like, that's every once in a while he'll write about that in the annual letters, which I think is kind of cool. He'll give an analogy of buying a farm and how that compares to buying gold and how much better a farm is than a gold investment. So like he does talk about it. But I think just if you look at some of the core principles of Warren Buffett, but also other long-term thinking value investors, they focus on risk and making sure you don't lose. Like that's Warren Buffett's number one rule of investing, I guess, is that, what's rule number one? Don't lose money. What's rule number two? Don't forget about rule number one. And so that can apply in a lot of different ways. And in real estate, I think the number one thing, the way I've seen people go out of business is their financing and their cash reserves. So let me explain each of those. The financing, I had a couple people I know who went out of business in 2007, 8, and 9, that same time when we were kind of having to go through a lot as young investors. And the reason they did was they had financing that had terms that required them to have to go get more financing right in the worst recession we've had in a long time. So if you had to look at some principles of financing, like the best kind of financing you can get if you have to get it is long-term fixed financing. So if you can get a 30-year fixed financing at 3% right now, and you're a young investor who's growing your portfolio, like that's smart, like that's really good. And I think you should do as much of that as you can within reason, within your game plan. And so we have done that. Like we've had no problem getting financing like that. In fact, we still have some seller financing at low interest rates and some other private financing. So like that's part of the story. The other part though is if you're going to use some debt, some leverage, you've got to have a really resilient cash position. So we've tried to maintain a lot of cash, and that really served us well in 2007 and 8. We had to lean on that because we made so many mistakes leading up to there. We had to actually eat into our reserves to pay for repairs that we underestimated, to pay for negative cash flow on some properties, to pay for turnover. So it's those unknowns that cash really comes into play. And so if you combine that, you can use some safe leverage. You can have some cash set aside, a good robust cash reserves. Those are kind of the application of that lesson for me, from Warren Buffett, to have that kind of worst case scenario first outlook. And then if you do that, I think you're going to be anti-fragile. You're going to be able to be resilient. And over time, like my goal has been to pay off some of that debt as well, just because why try to keep growing? Like why not pay off some debt, increase your cash flow, reduce risk even more? I guess I'm just saying all that. It's like I am low debt philosophy, but we definitely have debt. And I think Warren Buffett is good as he's used leverage his entire career. He used float from insurance, which was a very low risk form of leverage, kind of like a 30-year fixed mortgage, like that as a really low risk form of debt as well. And so it's not a bad thing to use it. It can just having a healthy respect for it, knowing that it can take you out if you're not careful, I think is the approach that Warren Buffett would advise.
I think that's probably one of the biggest things that new value investors misinterpret about Buffett. And I'm speaking from experience here because this is exactly what I did. Was when I started studying Warren Buffett, I thought that I needed to pick stocks like him and find exactly how he analyzes financial statements and do everything that he's doing exactly how he is to be successful like him. And then as I've studied him more and evolved and talked to people like you and learned on the podcast, I've realized Buffett is a lot more valuable to us as his principles than he is learning how to pick individual stocks. And so I think if you can take what Buffett teaches principle-wise and apply it to your life, I think that's a lot more impactful than it is to just copy his stock picks or how he runs his business or whatever it may be. I
agree. And I was listening to a recent interview. I'm trying to remember who was talking about it. It might have been on the Investors podcast, but it was talking about what makes Warren Buffett beyond just what we just talked about, the risk averse and margin of safety. He's also has a lot of lessons for us as real estate investors from just how he works with people. Like he runs this big conglomerate. He outsources and trusts people with the responsibilities that they have when they run the corporation. And so that's kind of where we are now too. Like, all right, if we're going to loan money to somebody, if we're going to invest in them and their business as this operator, we've got to trust them. Like we need to pick only people who we have very, very good trust. We feel comfortable that they will do what they said they're going to do, that they're competent, that we don't have to watch every single thing they do. That yes, we look at the financials and make sure things are working, but like that's a recipe for building a really good business is that human kind of trust, like that, the speed of trust, the way that valuable that is. That was a lesson that until this year I really didn't grasp from Buffett. And yet it's maybe one of his most impressive feats is to be a delegator who surrounds himself with really credible people and then entrusts them with his responsibilities, with his capital, and says, hey, go do it. And those people tend to rise to the occasion if you pick the right ones.
People always think of Buffett as a great asset allocator when it comes to picking stocks, which of course he is. Look at his track record. But outside of that, he's a great asset allocator when it comes to people and those types of things as well. And that's not necessarily as considered for a lot of people. They don't think of that as being an asset allocation, but it really is.
Yeah, being a judge of character and being able to weed out the ones who probably shouldn't mess with that person, shouldn't do a deal with them. And then when you do find the ones who are like gold, invest in that person. And I think about that, whether it's a contractor, like 1% of the contractors you work with are just awesome. And you need to just go with that person and stick with them and pay them what they're worth. And same with property managers, same with tenants. Tenants you can look at them a lot like an employee, they are the people who are the most important part of your business. If they can be a self-managing person, somebody who's responsible and pays their bills on time and can handle, like you can even give them lists that here's my plumber, here's my electrician, here's this person. If something comes up, just call this name. And if something weird, you can call me, don't worry about it. But like if you have a responsible tenant who wants to stay for a long time, they could be there for 10 years. You could make a lot of money. They could be very happy. They could self-manage themselves a little bit. And everybody could be happy. Like, isn't that amazing? Just by empowering that person and giving them a property that allows them to do that.
There are a lot of people that listen to the show that haven't bought their first property yet, but they're eager to, or they're still relatively new. They've acquired 1, maybe 2 properties. How should they be approaching this market? Should they consider sitting on the sidelines a bit longer to see how things play out? Or is now still a good time to get started?
I think it's always a good time. I think there are ups and downs in terms of how abundant opportunities are. Like if you were investing, if you just happened to get in 2008 and 9 and 10, you just got lucky. Like what? Good for you. There was just an amazing number of deals. But the rest of history, you're not always going to have those opportunities. And so I'm more of a dollar cost averaging within real estate philosophy. Like I just think you should always be buying. And you can be more strict on your criteria. You can be a little bit, like right now, we're not really that excited about buying anything new. But if a great deal in our market or another market plopped down on our desk, we would look at it. Like we're always a buyer because we would just sell something else. We would sell this other property we don't like as much and replace it with this one. And so I think if you're a new investor, the key is to get really clear on a couple things. Your target market, like where are you investing? Where is the place? And try to focus as much as you can. Don't try to be really broad with that. Get really, really focused on one area that you can learn and be very knowledgeable about. And then within that market, try to focus on one strategy. Like if it's house hacking, go with house hacking. If it's buying a turnkey rental, buy a turnkey rental. If it's a live-in flip, do the live-in flip. But get really good at that market. Get really good at that strategy. Focus. And what you'll find is that when you get that focus, opportunities start showing themselves. That's just the nature of it. And I really do believe this, that although the markets change and there's competition, there are always opportunities if you keep looking. There's always another deal. And the reason that's true is because there are a lot of people who are just looking and kind of sort of in it. But if you're all in, if you're committed, if you're willing to buy, if you prepare yourself to buy, there's going to be another deal. You might miss one particular deal, but there's always a next deal and then another. And so just take that attitude that there are opportunities out there and always be buying, have your criteria set, then now's still a good time to buy. I don't think that's going to change.
For a new investor that is just getting started with rentals specifically, what are some of the most important numbers for them to be aware of and make sure that they fully understand? Which ones do you personally focus on?
I think the most important number in real estate for rentals in particular is net operating income. This is, if you were a stock investor, you would get really good at looking at the earnings of a company and how those earnings are related to the price of what you're paying for a company. Well, in rental properties, the net operating income is just, you can think about it like the profit and loss of a rental property. You're taking the rent, you're subtracting all of the operating expenses, and you're leaving out the debt for the time being, not including how much your debt's going to cost. You're just looking at what is this property by itself without any capital allocated to it yet. How much income does that property produce? That's such an important number because even if you're not in a cash flow type market, in quotation marks, like even if you're buying in a growth market or one that they don't produce a lot of cash flow, that rental income is what you use to pay your mortgage. That's important. Like that's how you survive. That's how you can hold through different markets. And so knowing really closely what that net operating income number is, let's say it's $1,000 a month, you have $1,500 in rent, you subtract all your operating expenses and you have $1,000 left over. You now know that $1,000 is what you have to use to pay your mortgage, to pay yourself any cash flow. And that's as important as it gets in rental property investing. You can get complicated and throw all the other things out there, but if you just look at that number, you can then add in your financing costs, and you can add in your cash on cash return goals and all that. But it really just starts with that kind of basics of cash flow on a rental property.
When you think back on your life, whether it be personally or business related, real estate related, what piece of advice have you received that has really had an impact on you and you continue to use it and think of it to this day?
Man, that's a good question. Thinking of John Wooden, actually, for whatever reason. He's a basketball coach, Hall of Fame basketball coach at UCLA back in the day. I've just always been impressed with his approach to success. He defines success a little different than I think people think about it these days. You know, the Instagram, social media kind of success and driving the cars. For him, he was a really successful, by outward standards, basketball coach. His teams won more games than almost anybody in his era. I think they won 8 or 9 out of 11 national championships in a row. They went like a couple of years in a row, never losing a game. Like that's unbelievable. The interesting thing was his definition of success never had anything to do with wins and losses. If he were a real estate investor, it would not have anything to do with building wealth or making money. What he focused on was the little things. He would have his players come into practice before a season. About a day or two before they start practicing, he would have them practice putting on their shoes and tying their shoes and putting on their socks. And so I think that story, that piece of advice of just put on your socks, just tie your shoes and do that with excellence. This also reminds me the ancient Greeks, Aristotle and the other kind of philosophers back then had an idea that human excellence, they called it arete, was what it was all about. That was the best, most important thing. If somebody lived with arete, if they tied their shoes with excellence, if that happened to be the thing they had to do, if they were a janitor and they swept their floor with excellence, they were a real estate investor and they bought properties with excellence, you have nothing else is really guaranteed except for what you give to that situation. That lesson to me, both when I heard it from John Wooden, when I've heard it kind of echoed through other wisdom, like the ancient philosophers and different people, and it's just really had an amazing impact on me because it's so widely applicable, whether you're a parent, whether you're an investor, whether you're a football player like I used to do. It's just, you're here on earth. What are you going to do with it? What are you going to do with this opportunity you have? And so that's kind of been a core philosophy, an aspiration for me. Not saying I'll always do that, but it's been an aspiration to see, all right, how good can I be at being Chad today, and doing the best I can, put my shoes on, tie my shoes the best I can, and then move on to the next thing.
One of those reasons why in Wooden's example, putting your shoes and socks on is so important is because if you don't do those things right, correct me if I'm wrong, Chad, but I believe this is his philosophy, is if you don't do those two things right, you might get a blister, you might roll your ankle, something might happen in practice, and then guess what? You can't practice. And if you don't practice, you're not going to perform well in the game. Or you might get hurt and you can't even play in the game. So if you don't start by doing those small things right, you're not going to get to even participate or do the end goal.
Exactly. Yeah. It's just like the little things are everything. You can take that in two different ways. You can be obsessed and always worried about everything all the time, or you can just say, I have an opportunity in this moment, not to worry about tomorrow, not to worry about yesterday. This moment is what matters. Like, how prepared can I be? If I'm going to go buy a property, how prepared can I be? Like, I have control over studying my market. I have control over doing these things. And that's really what it comes down to. Like, there's some things we can control. There's some things we can't. Going back to your beginner real estate investor kind of mindset right now. Should I invest right now? Should I not? We have no control over the market. The Federal Reserve and what they do, we don't have any control over that. Whether the coronavirus vaccine works in a month or 9 months, like, we have no control over that. We do have control over, though, some things like our mindset, our attitude, how we approach the situation. And those little things lead to big things, both negative and positive. The blister, if they put their shoes on incorrectly and they put their socks on incorrectly, they do get a blister and they do miss practice and they are now performing at 80% of their capability in a game instead of 100. And guess what? They're not going to win games and they're not going to win championships now. And so it all comes back to that. It's really everything. This is how you approach whatever role you have in life, with excellence or not. And the good news is, like, you could have screwed up everything up to this moment, but you now have the opportunity right now to try to do it with excellence right now. And that's, to me, is really hopeful, really encouraging, because it's a present moment looking, but it's also, you learn from the past, but you don't have to dwell on it. You don't have to say, kind of keep beating yourself up about it. It's like, all right, right now, what can I do? How can I move forward? How can I be better? And that's the kind of lesson, I think about this as a parent, like, what can I convey to kids? Like, that's the kind of thing that I hope they take more from my example than the words. They're not going to listen to what I say, probably. They just kind of turn that off. But if you can try to be that way the best you can, your kids maybe pick up on that a little bit.
Chad, thanks so much for joining me again here on the show. For those listening that are interested in learning more from you and want to connect with you, where's the best place for them to go? Everything I do is kind of housed at coachcarson.com. That's my website. I have a podcast called the Real Estate and Financial Independence Podcast. So I'd love to, if you like podcasts, would love to hang out with you on there. Kind of a close friends and partners here with Robert. We've exchanged, send people back and forth. I think if you like his show, hopefully you'll like a lot of what we talk about on the show each week. Some of it's me talking. I do some interviews as well. Lately, I've been doing a lot of just looking over my shoulder as I coach a new investor or an intermediate investor, kind of how to do the next step and a real deal. And so we just have a lot of practical fun and focusing on financial independence, on real estate. In addition to the podcast, I do a YouTube channel, and I'm kind of focusing more on that too, more for the kind of tutorial type stuff. If you want to look over my shoulder and me draw out how to analyze a deal or do something, that's more my approach on the YouTube channel. But whatever works for you, I'd love to hang out with you. Just search for Coach Carson and you'll find it. Chad's absolutely right. If you guys like our content here at TIP and here on my show, I know you'll like his as well. So I'll put a link to everything he's working on in the show notes so you guys can go check that out. Chad, thanks so much. I enjoyed it. It's always a pleasure, Robert. Thanks for having me. All right, guys. That's all I had for this week's episode of Real Estate Investing. I'll see you again next week.
Thank you for listening to TIP. Make sure to subscribe to We Study Billionaires by the Investors Podcast Network. Every Wednesday, we teach you about Bitcoin, and every Saturday, we study billionaires and the financial markets. To access our show notes, transcripts, or courses, go to theinvestorspodcast.com. This show is for entertainment purposes only. Before making any decision, consult a professional. This show is copyrighted by the Investors Podcast Network. Written permission must be granted before syndication or rebroadcasting.
Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on our next podcast episode and new investing resources. What are your takeaways and thoughts about this discussion? Let us know in the comments section below.